Help me reach 1,000 subscribes. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every comment. Thanks. It was supposed to be a joyful day. Emma and I had been married for 9 years, and when her cousin's wedding in Manchester came up, I thought it would be a simple, pleasant escape from the monotony of everyday life. I had planned carefully: a crisp navy suit, polished shoes, and a tie that Emma said brought out the color in my eyes. We arrived early, greeted familiar faces, and I tried to settle into the rhythm of the evening. From a very first toast, I noticed her mood was off. Emma's smiles were forced, her laughter hollow, and her attention drifted to her phone every few minutes. I brushed it off, thinking maybe she was simply distracted or tired from travel. But as the night progressed, I began to notice how she interacted with other men, how her gaze lingered a little too long, the subtle way she leaned toward them in conversation, the quiet way she laughed at jokes that weren't even that funny. It didn't hit me immediately. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into casual gestures. After all, we had survived the usual ups and downs of marriage. But a niggling sense of discomfort kept growing. It was during the reception dinner that the first real sign came. We were seated at a table near the dance floor. Emma excused herself to speak to one of her old friends, and I watched her move with that fluid grace that had always drawn me to her. A young man I didn't recognize approached her as she talked, and from across the table, I caught a flash of recognition in her eyes. One of those looks that makes your chest tighten for reasons you can't articulate. She smiled, and the smile didn't reach her eyes. It was playful, secretive, and I realized with a sinking heart that it wasn't meant for me. I tried to shake off the unease and focus on the music, on the laughter around me, on my own attempts at conversation. But my attention kept drifting back to Emma. Later, during the first dance, she took my hand, smiled, and whispered something that sounded innocent enough, but the tone, sharp, calculated, made my stomach knot. She had embarrassed me once before in a small, private moment, and I had forgiven her. But tonight felt different. Tonight it was public. As the evening progressed, the wedding turned into a blur of speeches, laughter, and applause. And then it happened, the moment that shattered my carefully maintained composure. Emma stood in front of a crowd of our friends and her family, laughing at a joke the best man made. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, she said something to me in front of everyone. A joke, she claimed, but the sting was unmistakable. She mocked a personal habit of mine, something I had always been sensitive about. My cheeks burned with humiliation. The people around us chuckled politely, oblivious to the sharp cut behind the words. I felt small, exposed, and entirely unseen by the person who was supposed to know me best. For a brief second, I considered laughing it off, pretending it hadn't hurt me. But that would have been a lie I was no longer willing to tell. I excused myself to the balcony, pretending I needed fresh air, my heart pounding, my hands shaking with anger I didn't fully understand yet. I leaned against the railing, staring at the city lights, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. It was there, under the cold November sky, that the truth became unavoidable. The awkward glances, the secret smiles, the public humiliation. They weren't isolated incidents. They were pieces of a larger puzzle I had been ignoring for months. Emma wasn't the same woman I had married, and if I was honest, she hadn't been for quite some time. When I returned to the reception, she was laughing with that same young man from earlier. My stomach turned. The casual intimacy between them, touches on the arm, leaning close to speak, was unmistakable. I wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation, to shout and shake her until she admitted what I already feared. But I didn't. I stayed seated, silent, watching as my marriage, in that brief moment, revealed its fragility to me. The ride home was a quiet one. Emma chatted about the wedding, about memories and old friends, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I stayed quiet, staring out the window, feeling a cold clarity settle over me. I knew in that instant that something had irrevocably changed. The woman beside me was no longer my partner in the way I had imagined, no longer aligned to the life we had built together. By the time we pulled into the driveway, my decision had been made. I didn't shout, I didn't cry. I simply looked at her, fully aware of the shift between us. and said the words I had rehearsed in my mind for the past hour. I can't do this anymore. Her eyes widened, confusion and a hint of guilt flashing across her face. She opened her mouth, probably to protest, to justify, to manipulate. But I didn't wait. I went inside, sat in the quiet of our living room, and let the silence speak for the rest of the night. In that silence, I understood something I hadn't fully admitted to myself until then. I was done not because of a single embarrassing moment, but because that moment crystallized months, maybe years, of emotional neglect. The shock, the betrayal, the humiliation, they had all converged into one undeniable truth. That night, as Emma went to bed, unaware of the storm she had stirred, I lay awake, heart pounding, mind racing, knowing that by morning, nothing would be the same. By morning, my next steps would be clear. By morning, the decision that had formed quietly, patiently, finally had a face and a name: divorce. Morning came with a heavy stillness. The sunlight slanted through the blinds, cutting lines across the floor, but it did nothing to lighten the weight pressing down on me. I had stayed up most of the night thinking, replaying the wedding, Emma's laughter, that humiliating moment. Every detail sharpened the clarity I had felt the night before. I couldn't ignore it anymore. This was not a fleeting anger or a temporary sting. This was the end. I prepared myself calmly, dressed in the same navy suit I had worn to the wedding, though now it felt like armor rather than celebration. I didn't wake Emma. She was still asleep, unaware of the storm that had been quietly gathering, one that would finally break through the fragile surface of our marriage. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee, running through the conversation I knew I needed to have. But as I stared at the mug, I realized there was no conversation left to be had. Words had failed months ago. Her actions had spoken louder than any explanation, any apology. By the time she woke, I was ready. She emerged from the bedroom, hair messy, eyes still heavy with sleep, smiling weakly as if nothing had changed. I didn't return the smile. Instead, I looked at her quietly, letting the tension build. She hesitated, sensing that something was different, that the calm I wore like a shield was something far more serious. I can't do this anymore, I said again, my voice steady, unwavering. Not a question, not a plea, just a statement of fact. She blinked, confusion giving way to something like anger, but it didn't reach her eyes. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice a little too casual, too rehearsed. "The wedding," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on her. "Last night, everything. I've ignored it for months, years even, but last night made it impossible to pretend anymore. I can't keep living like this. The humiliation, the disrespect, the distance, it's over." Her face flushed, a mixture of shock and indignation. "You're overreacting," she said, defensive. Try to regain control, to twist the narrative as she often did. "It was a joke, a moment. It didn't mean—" I held up a hand, cutting her off. "No, it wasn't a joke. It was the culmination of everything that's been missing in this marriage. Respect, connection, love. I've been patient. I've tried to make it work, but I've reached my limit." She opened her mouth, proud to argue, but I could see the uncertainty flicker. She hadn't expected this. No dramatic fight, no tantrum, no begging. I was calm, precise, resolute, and that threw her off balance. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, letting the words settle between us like a hammer hitting stone. "I've already contacted the lawyer. Everything will be handled formally. No arguments, no threats, no dragging this out. We'll do this cleanly, but we're done. This is final." For a moment, she looked like she might laugh, like she was going to turn this into a joke or a test. Then the reality hit her. Her face drained the color, eyes wide as the truth of my decision settled. And in that moment, I felt a strange clarity, a mixture of relief, sorrow, and cold satisfaction. She tried to argue, tried to manipulate, but the calm certainty in my demeanor made her falter. "You can't just—" she stammered. "Yes, I can," I replied evenly. "And I am—" The days that followed were a whirlwind of logistics and legal details. I met with my lawyer, signed papers, and began the process that would separate our lives permanently. There were moments of tension, Calls from friends and family tried to mediate, trying to change my mind. But I stayed firm. For the first time in years, I was acting for myself, not to salvage someone else's disregard for me. Emma, of course, tried to spin the story. She claimed she was blindsided, that I had acted rashly. But the truth was undeniable. My patience had run out. The humiliation at the wedding was not the spark. It was a lightning strike on a tree that had been rotting inside for years. I had given everything: love, loyalty, support, and what I received in return was mockery, neglect, and betrayal of the emotional contract we had made when we said, "I do." The final confrontation came 1 week later at the lawyer's office. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene, just paperwork, signatures, and the quiet end of a chapter one had once thought would last a lifetime. She sat across from me, tense, fuming internally, while I maintained an exterior calm. In that room, I realized something important. Closure wasn't about her acknowledgement. It was about my understanding that I had finally honored myself. When I walked out of that office, the weight I had carried for years seemed to lift slightly. There was grief, yes, for the marriage that could have been. But there was also liberation, clarity, and an unexpected thrill of survival. I had been pushed to the edge, embarrassed, and humiliated, yet I had emerged not broken, but resolute. Life would be different now. There would be adjustments, challenges, and moments of doubt. But the certainty of self-respect, the knowledge that I refused to remain in a situation where I was unseen, undervalued, and mocked, gave me a sense of power I hadn't felt in years. The story that began with embarrassment had ended with clarity, with freedom, and with the understanding that sometimes the most shocking, the most painful moments are the ones that finally make us see the truth and act on it.